silence in so many
Okay.
different places.
So how do we know when you're ready?
Oh, you can.
Okay. All right, we're in. Give us 1 minute to get him. This meeting is being live streamed. Yes, thank you.
And you're live now. So.
Yes. Should we have?
It's gonna come through. I don't know where it's in. Okay.
We're just waiting for a thumbs up
Let's
from Dan.
ask Jen to mute hers first.
Jen, can you mute for just a second?
Yep. I wonder why that's happening like that. Just ask her to stay muted unless she asks a question.
Jen, you've got a weird feedback, so if you can just mute until you're ready to talk. Great. All right, and we've already recorded.
And we're on YouTube.
And we're on YouTube.
Just waiting for Facebook.
We're live, just waiting to link to Facebook, and then we will go.
And then I'll probably step out.
That's fine.
But I'll come back like 56. Good to go.
All right. Everybody ready?
See you later.
Welcome to Reading for Life. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Austin Public Library, and I'm here today with friends to talk about the book Where the Crawdads Sings by Delia Owens. Reading for Life is a program designed to grow community around a shared love of literature. Real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. With me today is my co-host, Michael Verde, who founded Reading for Life in 2005. We're also joined today by Steve Harson, Public Library Consultant for Southeastern Libraries Cooperating, and Jen Lawhead, Director of Community Education in Austin. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. We've had some strange little tech issues, but I think we're good to go for our lecture today.
Yay. Nice to be here.
Michael, you want to get us started?
Well, good to see you guys. First, let me say that let's think about a way to get into the book without doing a plot summary that'll nevertheless introduce some of the main characters and themes that we can then work through together in whatever way our imagination leads us. So one way to think about the way that meaning is made, and there's two principal ways that meaning is generated. Number one is through opposites. If you think about it for a second, it's kind of opposite. It's kind of obvious. We know what tall is only because we know what short is, and vice versa. And with regards to this particular novel, the opposites of life and death are interestingly contrasted in a conspicuous way, including the first two paragraphs. And we can circle back to that in a second. But in any case, opposites are a way that we make meaning out of things and orient ourselves to whatever complexity we might be observing or participating in. The second way that meaning is made is through, you could say, a fusion of two things becoming one, including things that were opposite. Maybe a quintessential example of both of those could be Romeo and Juliet, with the Montagues and the Capulets as a kind of opposites, and even with the color schema of the play of red and blue, for instance, or contrast these primary colors. But then you can also think about what is love. That's Romeo and Juliet coming together. So what were really up and coming young people or the seeds of these two antagonistic camps within Verona. It is Verona, right? In any case, these two antagonistic camps come together to become this one. And interestingly, in that moment of becoming one, there is also life and death. I mean, one of the things about is Romeo going to stay when the sun is coming up. It's outside of Juliet's window there. The sun is coming up, and she's warning him that when the sun comes up, your life is going to be in danger. And he has to decide, do I stay or do I go? And if he stays, he gets his love, but he loses his life. If he goes, he gets his life, but he loses his love. So it's a wonderful kind of play on opposites. In any case, that's a way we can work our imaginations into this novel. Is let's take, first of all, opposites that come to mind and see what sort of scenes or characters present themselves in that schema. And then we can consider two or more things becoming one thing. And then after we do that, we'll just sort of see what we can develop from ideas that have come up, however spontaneously. So somebody get us started with opposites.
The wildness of the marsh versus the civilization on the land.
Bravo. Let's keep an eye on that because it's huge, right, for structure and everything in the novel. And secondly, just to kind of develop that idea a little bit with regards to language, the narrator makes a similar contrast between the language of the court and the language of nature. Related, both of, in other words, both of those worlds, the world of civilization and the world of wildness, are also metaphorically identified with uses of language. There is a kind of wild use of language, and then there is a civilized use of language. So great, somebody else.
I was thinking a lot about the kindness of Jumpin' as contrasted or opposite of the treatment of the folks in town.
Okay, wonderful. That's a great example, and that's interesting to think about. Jumpin' and Maybelle, what world are they coming from? Because geographically they're situated in, you could say, in the civilized world, but I think we can recognize they're marginalized. There's because of their race, they're not really integrated and accepted into the world in which they're geographically set. So that's kind of interesting how they're, I don't know if there's necessarily in between, but there's certainly clearly more affinities between Kaya and Jumpin' and Maybelle than there is between the city folks and Jumpin' and Maybelle. So that's an interesting contrast.
And I think that they are definitely in between. They are on the margin of the marsh. They are the connection between civilization and the marsh. That dock represents a lot in that regard. And so I see them very much as being in that middle ground, or being the arbiter between the marsh and civilization.
Great. And even dock, metaphorically speaking, that's a great way to think of it, right? A dock is in between the water and the land. Wonderful. Great. Julie, what about a contrast?
I think the two characters of Tate Walker and Chase Andrews, but that's similar to that wild marsh versus civilization. So you have Tate Walker, who kind of represents that the more natural or nature character, and then you have Chase Andrews, who's more of the civilized, in theory, character.
Great. Let's I mentioned life and death is an important contrast in the first two paragraphs. And I just want to talk about it just because of the consequence to the overall novel. You can think of openings and endings for a writer as particularly they're supercharged with consequence. Let's put it that way. You're introducing what is very likely going to be a theme that's realized in a greater degree of complexity and developed. And then you're also kind of bringing things to a kind of a closure, often an epiphany of a sort. So in this particular novel, the first two paragraphs makes a distinction between the marsh and the swamp, which is kind of interesting because we think of the marsh and the swamp as sort of being synonyms or synonymous with one another. But in fact, she makes a distinction in the very first sentence: the marsh is not swamp. Now, your very first sentence, that's really a big deal. So what's important about the swamp not being a marsh? And she distinguishes in the marsh is where essentially things are alive and generative, but the swamp is where all things go to decompose. That there is nothing about the swamp that has this kind of generativity. And yet her last, in part of the last sentence of the second paragraph, she says, life decays, speaking about the swamp, life decays and reeks and returns to the rotted duff. Then the last part here, a poignant wallow of death begetting life. So she does make a kind of turnaround here where that death in this instance, in the swamp, although it is a place of absolute decomposition, is also the place from whence all life comes. So let's just put life and death as opposites here. And I think we lost some electricity. Speaking of life and death and where things go to decompose, a light and darkness is very apposite here. We don't do this, folks, to be tricky. It's just something about the imagination that gives us away. In any case, how about this notion of death begetting life? Because I think in some ways it's counterintuitive. and yet it seems to be thematically at a kind of nuclear or the nucleus of this novel, that there's something about death that is absolutely vital. So somebody take us from there.
Well, on that first paragraph, I really strongly felt, even as I was exposed to it the first time, that that paragraph was also setting up the metaphor that the marsh represents Kaya, or Kaya represents the marsh. And in that sense, it sort of sets you up for the things that happen later in the book, that Kaya is not death, Kaya is not destruction, Kaya is not decay. And part of the surprise at the end is that you were set up for that at the very beginning.
Okay, that's a wonderful thinking of metaphors, to think of Kaya, aspects of Kaya being metaphorically identified to these two locales. Part of Kaya being metaphorically identified with the marsh, part of Kaya being metaphorically identified with the swamp. Excellent. Other cool thoughts.
Well, I think it's interesting that looking at that sentence, a poignant wallow of death begetting life, from that second paragraph, and then looking at the very last sentence of the book, which is way out yonder where the crawdad sings. I know we've talked a little bit about the title and how does the title fit in. People always ask that, and it's an interesting that, you know, where the crawdad sings is maybe where death begets life. That's where that happens, kind of metaphorically for this novel. And I think that is true. The death of the one character makes it possible for the other character to have a life, the life that she wants.
That's an interesting idea, that in one sense, Kaya is a source of death, but she is a source of death that in effect kills death.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about Kali, the Hindu goddess, that's, I think, related to, this is the blue goddess that seems so fierce. And you often see in Hindu mythology things that look demonic, and yet their role is often to kill the ego. That's what some of these Hindu gods that look so fierce, they are fierce because the ego itself, it requires that kind of ferocity. So in one way to think about what Kaya does, although she's a source of death, that the target or the recipient of her action is itself a source of death. So that's interesting to think about. And if there's some kind of moral justification for the ultimate vision, I think it would be related to the notion that the only thing that Kaya kills is something that is a source of death.
Also, for those of us in the Midwest, it may not be an obvious comparison, but isn't it true that crawdads, shrimp, lobster, those crustaceans, they live by feeding on decaying flesh, decaying things, and that then in that sense, they clean the environment? And so is there a part of that that plays into this story that if we lived in, say, the bayou, we might relate to really closely, but coming from where we come from, we need to have that called to our attention?
Wonderful. I did not know that about crustaceans, Steve. So that's wonderful. I'll take it to be the case, and that would be a wonderful tie-in. But Julie, maybe it was relate to what you just said too, Julie. I think one of the things you were pointing our attention to is what is out there beyond. I mean, where the crawdads sing are beyond. So what is it that is beyond? And maybe we can sort of link it to what we're talking about. What is it that is beyond? Which is kind of it's an interesting thing to think about, something that is beyond, in some ways, articulation or definition. And it's on the other side, let's say, of the civilized world, the other side of the world in which there's order. And yet at the same time, the beyond seems to be absolutely vital to the order in some way. In other words, even though it is beyond, it's playing a role that the order depends upon to maintain its order. So I think that is kind of what we're getting at a little bit here. What is this beyond? And why is it we can't afford to say, no going to the beyond? We don't want it at all. Apparently we need the beyond is what I'm trying to get at. And I'm wondering why that is the case, that we need the beyond.
Well, I think in this particular novel, she was so safe and so comfortable in her marsh, but kind of the source of her financial freedom, at least, was going into what she would consider the beyond, when she went to the town and she worked on her books. So moving to that beyond was a source of of some kind of freedom for her, even though she felt much more comfortable in her safe space.
And that's a great notion that beyond is relative, right? To where is home. I love what you did with that, Jennifer. The beyond for Kaya, in some sense, would have been town. So that's kind of relative. That is cool. And in this case, there was some kind of sustenance that was absolutely vital that she couldn't get. In other words, there was something about her life in the marsh that was absolutely self-sustaining, except for this piece. And now that you mention that, I had the same notion with regards to her heart, because in one sense, it didn't seem that Kaya needed people especially much, except with regards to her longing for a kind of affection that she simply could not get from the birds or the crawdads. In other words, I thought this was really interesting to think of the human heart, as much as we can be at home in the beyond, that there is something in our longing that draws us back to people, those unfair, duplicitous people that are also predators, that nevertheless our heart can't live without. So I thought that was an interesting kind of thing, that she did need people.
Well, and there's the beyond that is kind of what, you know, the civilization, but there's also, she talks about the beyond being where the crawdads sing. So there's also the where you've come from, and not just you, but your past, where you're, I think it's in the conversation that she has with Jody, and he's trying to explain why Ma left. And she, somebody says, you know, in nature out yonder where the crawdads sing, some parts of us will always be what we were, what we had to be to survive way back yonder. So I think that beyond is, there's almost two different ways you can look at it, is the beyond that you move towards and the beyond that you're coming from. And I think, again, that where the crawdad sings, it's kind of up to interpretation as to which, and maybe it varies in the book. Sometimes where the crawdad sings is where you've come from, and sometimes where the crawdad sings is maybe where you're trying to get to.
And I like the idea that that can be understood temporally. In other words, this could be a matter of time or space. And that's great. I never thought about that, but that is wonderful.
And you know, I think, Julie, as you said, that is beyond extends in both directions.
Yeah.
So for instance, there's also the beyond of her publisher, her publishing house that's in New York. When she meets with her publisher, she meets with them in some middle ground with the person who's working on her book, but doesn't really go to New York. And in a sense, that world is in a beyond state as well as the marsh is.
Very cool. And that's also, when you said that, Steve, I thought about, first of all, her success as a published naturalist, which is to say that she's celebrated within the civilized world at a very, I would say, very erudite level, in fact. And yet what distinguishes her work as this naturalist is something that is related to her seclusion or isolation. In other words, it's because she's so closely affiliated with the marsh and swamp. You could almost say she's the incarnation of this place. It's because of that intimacy that she's able to glean the kinds of insights with regards to details that the folks in the erudite academic world are oblivious to. So that's an interesting way of thinking about opposites, but also the way that they absolutely sort of require the contributions of one another. Very interesting.
I hadn't thought before about how she wouldn't have been able to be so successful with her paintings if she hadn't been so intimately connected. I probably should have thought about that, but I didn't think about how someone coming in from the outside wouldn't notice all the intricacies as someone who lived with it day to day.
Wonderful. And that's a huge verb or concept in the novel, isn't it? Noticing the details. This is a constant theme that she's discerning specificity. One of the ways that we know that Chase's future as a male character is probably not bright is with the way that he understands the marsh is something you use, and that relationship to that place makes him blind to the details. So he knows it as a general thing. And if we imagine this with regards to intimacy, you could imagine knowing the other person is something you use, in which case they're a general thing. That's a woman in general, let's say, from a man's perspective. If you're thinking about, as a teenage boy, something you're going to satisfy yourself with, but you don't need to know them intimately.
And in fact, there were several places in the book where that was expressly put into words.
Okay. Does one come to mind, Steve, or just in?
I can't think of one just offhand, but he dismissed as like just a woman, or all women. There are things that he says that convey that.
Yeah.
I don't remember a specific quote.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe that's one way we can think about the difference between Tate and Chase.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Tate is conversant with the detail. I mean, isn't one of the sources of their intimacy is they speak a common language, and the language in the alphabet is this natural world that they share.
Well, and even Kaya wasn't always the expert, because Tate had to show her how to come home, right? So there's that balance that she didn't know everything about her environment, even though she was deeply immersed in it.
Oh, wonderful.
And Tate brings poetry to her too, which is, he talks about, he introduces her to poetry, and he says, poems make you feel something. And if you follow the poems, and I've been meaning to go back through and just read the poems when they show up in the book all the way through, because I have a feeling that would also lead you to kind of a heads up of what's coming. When we were talking about noticing, what I remember thinking was, if you paid really close attention to Kaya's description of the insects that she was observing, you also see something coming. She talks about the fireflies luring the female fireflies, luring the males in. And I think there's a scene too, isn't there, with a praying mantis, that she's watching the praying mantises, and that they mate, and then the female kills the male, and she watches that. It's just, but it's like this subtle side. You don't realize it's part of what's coming until you look at it again afterwards and notice that those
I think you're really right about that, Julie, and that all of these things that you're referencing are devices that increase the complexity and the richness of this book, that I think raises it to, literary status, as opposed to just being a romance novel.
It's those layers.
Yeah, it's those many, and there's a lot of layers in this work. It must have been an immense undertaking to put it together.
Jennifer, what you said about Tate's introduction, or being a crucial catalyst for Kaya's maturity in lots of ways. The fact that he is the source of her literacy. And also that made me think about, we're going back to this beyond stuff, that you would, in order to write poetry that in some way would be, that would do justice to the indescribable. In other words, if you're going to do justice to the beyond, you almost have to use language that would make the beyond imaginable. So we need language to communicate things that almost defy articulation. But in any case, what I'm getting around is the role that poetry plays with regards to what we would think of as normal uses of language or civilized use of language. So how is poetry where the Crawdads sing, for instance, and how is it that we can use language to defy normal uses of language, knowing that we need these things that are not normal uses of language? In other words, there's something we get from poetry that we can't get from normal uses of language. And yet, if you did not learn the alphabet, and you could even think of a poet as someone that knows language at the kind of specificity that we're saying analogously relates to Kaya and the marsh. I mean, a poet knows words at that degree of detail, and consequently can use language in unanticipated ways, perhaps in some instances, unprecedented ways. I'm just trying to play around with the irony that we would need a common alphabet, an understanding of grammar that synchronized our our intellects in order to go beyond normal uses of language.
Well, and doesn't Tate say something to Kaya at the very beginning when the first time she reads a word? I think it's cab, and she's like, well, I don't know what a cab is. And he says, don't worry. He's like, you'll never not be a reader again. And it's that idea that he's opened this world up for her, with that what seemed like a very simple thing at the beginning that is going to bring all of this to her life. And the other thing I wanted to point out really quick before I forget too, is I thought it was interesting that Tate does, he brings her language and he brings her the ability, he brings her poetry, but you do find out too about midway through the book when Jody shows up back to Kaya's house and brings the paintings that he had received. And one of the paintings is of Kaya and Tate from when they're little. And so Tate's been a part of her life, you find out, from the very beginning. And so they had that Kaya doesn't even remember.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was interesting too.
And also that despite him being the one who brings her words, he's the one who destroys her words.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that her words then would be preserved, if presumably that they were published in the local paper. And so they might hang around in print form somewhere that way.
Mm-hmm.
So you mean Tate destroys her words at the end of the?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. This is great. You just pick a little trope of opposites and look what happens when you start talking about this novel and the way connections that I would have not have thought of when we sat down 15 minutes ago. Really wonderful.
Along the lines of the language piece, I've been thinking lately about some folks that I've had engagement with who in their first language didn't have words for colors. And so understanding the concept of color was beyond them because they didn't have the language to name it. And so I think there's some connection here too with providing language to name things in Kaya's life.
Well, and she does that, right? Once Tate teaches her how to read, she goes back to all of those feathers she's got on her wall and she names everything. And she uses, she writes the names and labels everything. So I think it's an interesting, they kind of describe that there too.
That I think is really the implication that are profound because it suggests for people that we do not have immediate access to the beyond. Or rather that there is aspects of the world that without language, we're not going to know, which I think kind of defies what would be intuitive that we could just sort of, when you find that every once in a while, they do have these feral children that are found in nature and they're always absolutely tragic because there's again and again, something about the development that they didn't have at a certain point that seemingly forever puts them in some ways on a different universe. In other words, there's something about feral children in which they don't become human in the way we imagine our own humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So that the irony I'm suggesting is to become fully even our wild self requires, in this instance, language. It requires something we share to even become something that is beyond.
And you might even extend that a little further to include our understanding of the beyond, that we might have the knowledge, but we don't have the words. And until we have those words, we might not know that we have the knowledge.
Mm-hmm, wonderful. And I wonder, I think that's a great hypothesis. Is it because we don't have the words and we don't know them? Or is it because without the words, they don't exist for us to know? Mm-hmm. And if you think about that, that might seem like it's a theoretical or blah, blah, blah kind of thing. But in fact, the entire, at least with regards to the Judeo-Christian tradition, absolutely hinges on what we're talking about here. Because in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, God is not in nature. This is absolutely vital, that God God speaks. In other words, God is outside of nature and creates nature. And one of the ways the Jewish people were distinguishing themselves from these pagan empires is that their gods were in nature, but the Jewish God was not in nature, but he was in language.
Well, let's go right back to the very beginning. I am the Word. The Word is God.
Yeah, there you go. So this is, I guess what I'm trying to just play around with myself is how language relates to the beyond. Because I think initially I would have thought of those as opposites, but now as we're talking, I'm not so confident that the opposite of the beyond is language. In regards to this novel, how that relates specifically to why Tate is a necessary and satisfying lover or other half, and why Chase isn't. In other words, there's a degree of intimacy that has something to do with them being able to communicate with a language that's beyond. Whereas with Chase, even though I think it's very clear that sexually she does feel that there's something between her and Chase that is primal. And yet it does not include this communicative element is what I'm getting at.
Chase's use of language is manipulative.
Okay, that's a wonderful way to put it. So let's think about that. I'm glad you said that. How is it that when we use language with poetry, I'm distinguishing poetry between normal use of language, and based on the great distinction you just made, how is it that when we create poetry that is actually pops, and we would say that's a poem as opposed to, well, let me try again tomorrow. When it pops, how I'm taking your idea, Steve, that maybe it's when we don't use language to achieve an instrumental end. In other words, we're not manipulating language to get something that enables language to manifest itself in a way that is absolutely consummating to our imagination and satisfying. In other words, when we don't try to use language to get something, that language reveals itself to us. And I'm just making an analogy between that and Tate and Chase.
Well, and doesn't that come back to the ego too? If your ego is in control, then you're always using language to manipulate. But if you can get your ego out of the way, then your language can be used to do other things, create, engage, in other ways, not manipulative.
I love that. And if we're thinking about Reading for Life having something to do with community, I'm just developing what you've suggested, Julie, that maybe there's communities that are essentially people in agreeing to use each other. Okay, it's not necessarily that we want to prey on each other, but I need something from you, you need something from me. It's transactional. Maybe there's communities like that, but then maybe there are communities where that's not the ultimate logic, where it's not transactional. In fact, that there's a degree to which we are feeding each other instead of feeding on each other. I would think only the latter, where you're feeding each other, would be a real community, and that the other would be, we'd need a different word for it. Maybe it's a society but in any case, the idea is, is there a sense in which, in order for us to be a community, a genuine community, instead of people manipulate each other, that we need to be able to access language and communicate with each other in a way that really lends itself to that kind of community? And if that's the case, then I'm suggesting that literature maybe offers us that, if you see what I mean, that we can meet it. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm not going to suggest that we go too far down this rabbit hole, but I wonder if it could be a topic of an entire discussion to look at the ways in which language is manipulated, or language is used to manipulate people, and what are the purposes and the methods that are used in the book to do both.
Okay, so we think of rhetoric as a way to manipulate people, but poetry, though it might have rhetorical devices, may not be the same thing as rhetoric. Well, the reason why I think there's something practical here is that you can think about many uses of language in which community is the last thing that's going to happen. I mean, when I turn on the news and I see that they put one side over here and one side over here, and the whole drama involves both sides taking truth and doing weird things with it, I think, I don't know what the chances are of community if we talk like this. So is it possible that we could find a space of communicating in which that really wasn't the structure of the engagement? And I'm suggesting maybe literature offers us that possibility. Like we're doing right now, we don't have to be on 4 different teams. We're all learning from each other. I just think that maybe this is a role that literature plays. It gives us a beyond in which assumptions can be decomposed. Absolute beliefs, normatively, for instance, once upon a time, African American people went to the back of the bus. That was normal. That was civilized. That needed to be decomposed for us to become more human. And I'm suggesting maybe literature offers us a space where we can take our beliefs that we're taking for granted and actually decompose some of them, if you see what I mean, so that we get to something more generative. Maybe literature enables us, in other words, to step back from our normal uses of language, to break out of these certain adhesions to beliefs, to see which ones do we need to decompose, because we may be harboring beliefs that are really need to go to the swamp.
I was listening to a podcast this morning that talked about in some spiritual places or some places of worship, manipulation is used. So when you talked about manipulation of language, I think there's also manipulation of the other senses of smell and sound and light. So it doesn't really have to do with the book, but it kind of prompted my thinking that I really hadn't thought about manipulation in the ways that we're talking about today and with that podcast. So that's really something that's going to be swirling in my mind for a bit.
Mhm.
Do you think it's possible to move people without manipulating people? I guess that's another way of thinking about poetry. Can we move people without manipulating people? And if we can, I don't know what community is. And if we can, I'd like to know where we learn this capacity.
Well, I think the difference you talked about was if it's generative or not, right? And so I think if it's generative, then I think then it's not done with manipulation. So that's kind of the connection I'm making.
Well, I think that's a really a great one. It's got a built-in sort of criterion or acid test.
Well, and it explains, I think, a lot of what we're seeing in the world today is exactly what you said, Michael, is a lot of times with the media, there is more manipulation than not. And we have lost maybe some of our spaces where we were having those more generative conversations. Whether it was newspaper, newsprint. And I mean, if you think back to, I've been watching a lot of like Bridgerton and those kinds of things. So you think back a couple hundred years ago where their media was written and there was space in between, and there was and now with our social media, I know I have kids, so it's one of the things I think about a lot is their communications come in smaller sound bites and there's less time to process or think through or interact. We've lost a little bit of that. And I think that's one of the things that I've enjoyed about this Reading for Life program is it's that the time in between the podcast and the lecture and the next podcast, it's the rereading, it's the talking through of those pieces with other people and doing exactly what we're doing here, where you have 4 different ideas. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I loved English and history as a student, because there were not history so much, but English, there were no necessarily wrong answers as long as you could follow through with the thought. Whereas in the calculus class I was in, it was black and white, right or wrong. And I was not very good at that. So it was one of those things that I appreciated. And I do think that's part of what, at least Michael and I, when we first started talking about doing a program like this, was that idea of, can you get people together to talk about those things and have those generative moments without the manipulation? Like, what does that look like and how does that function in society?
Julie, I think you're right. And I think about the books that we've talked about in the past and how much time we spend talking about words and the power of the word and how much care goes into crafting a book using the words and what those words mean. And that's true. And then bringing that back to this book and the concept of manipulation that we were talking about, I think we have some stark examples in this particular book of manipulating words to convey meaning in the form of poetry, and then manipulating a person by using the words that will motivate them to do what you're looking for. And that might be part of what we're seeing going on in our world around us today. So maybe this book has a message relating to that too.
Nice. I think about when 2 people come together in a genuine, intimate way, that they reach a point where they're not manipulating each other, I would think, ideally. And I'm wondering if that's possible too with language. In other words, I want to make a distinction between rhetoric and poetry at some point. I want to say that rhetoric can take us so far, but then maybe there's a relationship to language in which language gets an equal word in edgewise. In other words, it's not just our imagination that's making this, let's say, novel. It's our imagination in intimacy with language, and that the language is contributing to the final produce of the novel. And this is, I think, absolutely crucial. And we talk about the things they carry. And you can see that there's a very conspicuous theme that on the other side of ego, you might say, language starts to speak through us. We need each other, but there's a sense in which the novel's not coming entirely. You could say it's coming out of my imagination, but my imagination is partly has allegiance to the language and not to my ego. I just want to throw that out there, that actually maybe what makes art is when, in this case, verbal art, when language starts to get an equal word in edgewise, the way you would think a couple would be two people allowing genuine dialogue to come through them. I'm suggesting that with language, we can have a relationship with language that's like that.
And in the context of both the book and this conversation, our imagination is being guided by the manipulation of the words that the author put into this book.
Well, I think that's true, but I want to throw out the possibility that the manipulation may only get us so far. In other words, I want to suggest that maybe at a certain point, nobody's manipulating anybody, because something closer to two people becoming one is taking place with language. Now, I mean, that might be rare. Okay. I certainly think what you described is the norm, that we manipulate language to get things. But maybe there's a relationship with language where all of a sudden you hear something that's not coming from your own impetus. I'll put it that way. It starts to speak.
I think the author, Delia Owens, I think kind of the back of my book has some information from her. And I think she gets to that a little bit, where she says that one of the primary uses of, or one of the primary, a novelist is being a storyteller, but they have to be careful that their message isn't getting in the way of the story they're telling. And I think that's her way of acknowledging that there is, that the story she wants to tell, she realizes that as the storyteller, there is another story that's going to be told, and she doesn't want her intentions to get in the way of the story that's trying to be told through her telling the story. I thought that was really interesting when I read that she's acknowledging that as well, that there are multiple levels to storytelling. And I think what you're maybe getting at, Michael, is that one, like that kind of, when we get kind of that jolt out of having these conversations, and is when we're able to see that thread of what's coming through, maybe in spite of the author, in spite of us as readers, and when we can put ourselves aside and really just hear what's coming through the writing.
You know, Julie, I think that's really a smart observation. And you've hosted many authors in your library. In my career, I've hosted zillions of authors in my libraries. And I think how often I have heard the author say that they don't go into the story knowing what the story is going to be, that they have to start writing it so the characters can tell them what the story is. And I think that relates right back to what you're saying Delia Owens wrote in the book.
Well, and I think we heard that from Tim O'Brien as well.
Yes, absolutely, we did.
Don't you think that must be the buzz if you're a writer?
Oh, sure.
All of a sudden, they say if you ever hit a perfect golf swing, you'll never quit playing golf. I don't know. I've never hit a perfect golf swing, but I would think that an analog to that in writing is if you're ever writing one day and all of a sudden you start to experience the presence of something speaking through you, that's probably a very addictive feeling.
And honestly, among practicing authors today that I've interacted with, most of them, in my estimation, would tell you that that's how they write and why they write, because they have to find out what the characters are telling them. There are the few who do very much the opposite, and we have some prominent ones right here in this area who begin with a story and an outline, and then they fill in. But today the common practice seems to be to let the characters tell the author what their story is.
Remember the epigraph or a little preamble to the Song of Solomon is Toni Morrison saying, I used to hear people talk about the muse, and I thought that was just a way that writers kind of strategically deflected questions they didn't want to answer. But because of this book, I'm absolutely convinced that that's the case. And she gives the example that she wrote a sentence, not thinking too much about it as an opener, and it turned out within the sentence, the entire novel was germinating, and she didn't realize it until. So I suspect that whatever we mean by art has something to do with what we're talking about now. It's something that gets a word in edgewise that we're not manipulating.
And maybe that words are ultimately the key to human consciousness.
That's my thought. I mean, I wouldn't know what human consciousness is if it isn't a kind of conversation with yourself or with the other. I mean, I don't know what we mean by consciousness if it didn't involve some kind of dialogue with something.
Well, and we think about with the brain development in young children, and the most important thing that can be done to build that brain and build the synapses is to talk, read, and sing with them. Oh, shoot, sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
I was
that is power, Jennifer.
But the language is the key to the brain development. It isn't black and white flashcards, and it's that talking, the reading, the singing, the language, and the connections with people through that language. And so I think that connects a lot to the theme we've been talking about today.
And what if we think of consciousness, the brain, the human intellect as the beyond, and that we have to find a way to understand that, and our tool is words.
That's wonderful. Okay, then playing off what Steve said, what if language is like the dock to the beyond? That's a wonderful way that would be a very interesting way to think of language as opposed to a tool. I mean, part of my PhD work has to do with making a distinction between language as a tool and language as a medium. And a medium even sounds like dock, something that is allowing conversation in both directions. Very different than a hammer. Well, speaking about this, without getting into too much of current affairs, I think we do recognize that we're in a very polarized moment. And I do wonder if it would be possible for people to come together who might have beliefs that are very antagonistic at one level. But I wonder if it would be possible to put those beliefs, let's say, just in brackets for a bit, and to engage with works of literature and to see if maybe some kind of conversation could take shape that didn't involve pitting one binary against the other. We started out saying meaning is made in two ways, through opposites and through mergers. And I wonder if it might be possible for people who are stewards of very contrary beliefs to find mergers through a medium that wasn't designed to sell commercials. I mean, this is what most of our TV is about, is to sell a commercial. So we have to think that behind the collisions that are generated is the idea to keep you watching long enough to sell you shampoo or a car. Maybe works of literature aren't trying to sell a shampoo or a car, and so therefore it doesn't have to play those kinds of games. And I'm just wondering, it is a make-believe scenario where people from very different ideological camps could take a work of poetry or a novel, and maybe the first 2 hours there would be an opportunity to punch each other, subtly or not subtly, but maybe after hour 2 something else might happen. And I wonder if through that kind of intercourse, those people might discover that there's aspects about themselves that really there's far more in common than what the news would have us to believe. I like to think that's possible.
Well, I mean, looking at the four of us, I think that's why we're in the fields that we're in. right? I mean, that's the goal, like between education and librarianship. It's how do you create those moments to get people in a room who don't agree to have a conversation and make a connection and find those points. And I think that's what keeps sometimes me motivated to do what I do, is having those moments where you see it work and then trying to figure out how to spread that and how to make sure that that's happening in other places and that people are aware of, did you know that it's possible to have a really meaningful conversation with someone that you don't agree with, and that you can find points in common, and that changes then you, and that changes your relationship, and that changes the world. And that is how one person can make a positive difference, whether it's through educating a child or, teaching a college course to young people who are getting ready to launch out into the world, or having an interaction at a library with a homeless person, or I think that kind of, in a nutshell, describes my motivation throughout my career.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
I don't know what education would be if there wasn't something that was beyond manipulation, because I would feel like I was just teaching these young people how to be more rhetorically adroit at manipulating each other. As if there wasn't something beyond that. And isn't every discipline really a certain methodology and set of practices that wean the ego from getting the last word in? I mean, this is when you learn how to be an anthropologist, you're learning things that would make your findings replicable and not about your opinion. All of a sudden, it strikes me that maybe what is beyond belief. I'm thinking now where the Crawdads Sing, and I'm thinking now that the beyond is beyond beliefs. Okay, this is beyond beliefs. That if there's not a place beyond beliefs, we're never going to be the United States of America, because I don't know that we're united through our beliefs. It might be that our beliefs, in fact, divide us, but there might be something beyond our beliefs that unite us. And I think that's an interesting way to think about poetry, because in a sense, you don't believe or not believe in poetry. You don't, a metaphor is not believable. And yet apparently we need it to satisfy something in us, the way that Kaya needs Tate to satisfy something in her, and vice versa. What is this beyond belief that we need in order to be united? I think is a very interesting way to think about art. Well, guys, you always fire me up. Whenever we sit down to talk, kind of have a thought or two, but not too many. And then every time it dawns on me about 6 or 7 minutes in the conversation, oh my God, we're not going to have time to explore all the things that we put on the table. So thank you so much for, one, just getting into the novel. It's so much more fun to read knowing that you have a group of kind, smart, just people that love life to talk about the novel with in a non-competitive way. So that adds to my reading life. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought this has been such an interesting this is the 7th novel that we've done. And this is the one that I was the most worried about, because I had not read it before, and I did not know if we were going to be able to pull out enough from it. And I know Steve and I have talked about this, that I've really turned around with this book. And this is, I think, a really great work of literature. And I was surprised by that, to be honest.
Yeah, I also was surprised because commonly in the library, when things become like a popular sensation, they're usually not really something of substance. But this particular book, and I avoided reading this book because of that, but when it became the assignment for this project, I read it, and I'm so happy, because I honestly believe that this is going to have enduring value, and it's going to be held on to as a work of great literature in our culture.
Yes. So with this lecture, we did a podcast that is available on the library website at aplmn.org, and we will be doing another one here coming up soon. And then our next book is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. And this one also is a little different. This has more of a science fiction thread, but is very much, I think, going to be an interesting conversation. It has a lot to do with gender, which is also very much, in the news right now and a popular thing. And it's a difficult book. If you haven't read it before, if you pick it up and if you get really stuck and you want to throw the book across the room, don't call me or do call me. Don't throw the book. Call me and we'll chat a little bit more about it. But I'm really looking forward to that next discussion as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Just a quick note, Julie, because it is a hard book to read, everybody should know that it's available through the library system in downloadable audio, and there won't be a waiting list because we got the model with the 100 simultaneous users. So
Perfect.
up to 100 people could read that book at once.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've never been one for audiobooks, but with Where the Crawdads Sings, I actually listened to the first half of it first, and it did help. And there have been, Dune was another one that I had to see it visually and listen to it first before I could get, because of all the strange language. So there are times where that audio, even if you're not an audiobook fan, this might be, the Left Hand of Darkness might be a good one to try that on. And I've been meaning, I need to do that too, because I think that'll be a different way for me to read this novel. Great. Thank you, everyone. And we will see you again soon.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Hang on.
I had to
Thank
kick
you.
that in there about the audiobook, Julie, because
Yes.
what I have found is that when there's a book that's really dense, really